I'm Mabel Barrison, the Director of Institute for European Studies here at Cornell, and I welcome you to our first seminar of academic year 22-23. We will be continuing our theme on challenges to democracy, which we began last year, and also continuing our anniversary commemoration of the 30th anniversary of the founding of European Studies here at Cornell. And in keeping with our new initiative to develop research pods around particular themes, we're beginning with a populism pod. And we are delighted to welcome our visiting fellow, Oscar Mazzoleni, who is an expert on populism, comparative populism. Oscar Mazzoleni comes to us from the Institute of Political Studies, the Faculty of Social and Political Sciences at the University of Lausanne. He is current from 2016. He's been a titular professor in political science at the Institute of European Politics in Lausanne. He has a PhD in modern history from Lausanne, and he's done postgraduate work in philosophy, anthropology, and sociology. He's held visiting professorships in political science at the University of Turin, Columbia University, European University Institute, the Sorbonne, among numerous other European and American universities. For the year 2019 to 2023, he is the research director of a project on right-wing populist discourse in European cross-border areas, a comparison of Switzerland and Luxembourg. He's also been the chair of, and continues to be, the chair of the steering committee of the Standing Group in Political Sociology at the European Consortium for Political Research. He is currently in the process of completing a book with his collaborator, Carlos de la Torre, on populism as a challenge for key concepts of social and political sciences. Professor Mazzoleni will speak to us about his theories of populism today. He'll speak for about 45 minutes, and then the floor will be open to questions. Professor Mazzoleni, we welcome you.
So many thanks for this invitation. Many thanks also to the director of Institute for European Studies, Mazzoleni Barrison, for being here with you as with the scholar. And I'm really happy to share with you some reflections, some critical reflection on a topic that I try to deal with, and share my. You have to share my PowerPoint. Yes, thank you very much. And so the topic that I try to develop today is about populist conceptualization. My research field is European countries, but also US in the last time. I'm an empirical scholar, and I try to use model framework of analysis in order to check, to verify, to discuss empirical knowledge in a comparative perspective in a current politics in Europe and the US. At the same time, I'm really unsatisfied by the way by which scholars in this kind of subfield that we can call populism try to grasp, understand the phenomenon they label as populist or populism. And this is the reason, because I try to share with you some reflection about the relation between populism and complexity. Populism and complexity are not really, they have no real connection usually. Is a kind of hidden connection, because populist scholars usually try to simplify what they try to understand as populism. So the question is, of course, why this response answer to this issue? Because usually the perception of this concept in social and political science is based on the following assumption. This concept maybe doesn't exist, or is too vague, is ambivalent. Why? Because it is very contextual oriented, but increasingly global. So it's a contextual oriented or global. There is a widespread controversial issues about what exactly is the object of populist scholar. We talk about ideology, we talk about on discourse, we talk about styles or movement or whatever. So we don't know exactly on what we have to talk and analyze. And then we have this kind of elastic definition, often exclusionary. Some scholars say populism is seriously only an ideology. Populism is just a style of communication. And often the communication and the discussion among scholars is very difficult. So the main question is populism really a useful concept from an analytical point of view or not? Can answer to this question in two ways. The first is just to simply to avoid the concept, because it's too vague, unuseful. We replace it with other concepts, nationalism, for instance, extremism, fascism. We can use other concepts, try to grasp, to understand the phenomenon, for instance, social political contention, right-wing political parties, etc., avoiding this concept because of these difficulties, etc. At the same time, we have to observe a growing literature, a growing industrial trend in the literature in social and political science, specifically on populism. There are everyday scholars publish something about populism. Maybe everybody of them are wrong, but I think that's my personal feeling. I think we can find something good or something interesting, trying to take in account some limits, but also some values of this growing literature on populism. There are some, in my opinion, useful results, interesting approaches in order to understand some critical junctures in our society, some big challenges in democracy, in the evolution of democracy in our time. So, but if you take this seriously, you say, okay, we start, maybe it's wrong, maybe you do not share this opinion, but if you start from taking in account this concept, we can follow two ways, or two paths. We can follow the idea that we need a general, universal definition of populism, avoiding going beyond any ambiguity or vagueness. So we should define clearly in one time, in one shot, for today and also for the future, a definition that is able to be shared by scholars. Then you have a second stream or second path, much more modest, considering this is an illusion, trying to find a universal definition of populism. For instance, if we imagine a virtual discussion among Karl Marx, Max Weber, and Polanyi around what is capitalism. Capitalism is defined in very different ways. So the final discussion, the final part of the discussion should be capitalism doesn't exist because we don't share a definition, a common definition. So we can start off the idea that this is a problem we have to put away this concept, or we can also consider the possibility that there is not one universal definition, but we can imagine that there are many ways to consider this concept, many definitions in the plural sense, trying to cope with the complexity of the social and political phenomenon that we call or we label populist across time and space. So much more adaptive definition. So of course, capitalism could be a model of production, can be a kind of society based on the market. But it's really necessary to decide in one shot forever what is the definition that we use for our research questions. That's, of course, two kinds of perspective. The preferred perspective is based, for instance, the most important and well-known scholar, Casmude, the Dutch scholar, defends the idea that we need a universal definition, which defines a minimal core, definition of populism based on ideology. He said, populism is ideology, or it doesn't exist. It should be or must be considered an ideology. So just a universal definition. Maybe this is the good way to adopt for scholars, and then connecting with so-called host ideologies, for instance, nationalism, for instance, other ideology, liberalism, and others. But the idea is we need this kind of universal minimal definition. At the same time, we have a rising perspective based on this idea that we have to be much more aware in a Weberian sense, that reality is complex. We cannot just deal with the reality in a definitive, unique way. We have kind of ideal types, and we have to be much more concerned about the idea of approach in terms of multi-definitional approach and an open, considering populism an oriented concept, capable to connect with the diversity of challenges emerging in current democratic system. Of course, this means that populism is not just a one-shot concept, but it also should be sensitive, adaptable from the way the cycle of contention, the cycle of critical juncture in our society. That means also to consider that a strong critical juncture as the COVID pandemic, this is just an example I give you and I share with you. How can we imagine to adapt and to reconsider populism if we look at the responses by some kind of party, some kind of movement during the COVID pandemic? Our populist research agenda, how the concept can adapt in relation to this political response. This is the idea. So populism can be a one-shot universal concept or adapted to the different critical juncture, the different challenges coming from the society, coming from also in terms of in an historical perspective, and try to be aware of the nuance of the changes that in the society arise, and also in connection with populism. If you look at the pandemic times, just again here, just two examples because the debate could be very long. I give you some insight from around two concepts. One is conspiracy, and the other is individual sovereignty, showing how these two concepts can help us to rethink populism in respect this transformation, these challenges of course, of pandemic times. If you look, of course, we have to be aware each context is relevant. I look just here, very modestly, on Western radical white politics in the 2020-21, showing or considering which are the response of these parties face the pandemic outbreak. So what we can see, considering the first analysis, the first empirical analysis provided by scholars. On the one side, we show that mainly these parties used to respond by their own ideological, traditional styles, with using nativism, nationalism, authoritarianism, anti-Semitism, and so on. There are many parties, many leaders using kind of elements in their own discourse, in their agenda. However, that's the point. That's the point. Of course, the pandemic time is a critical, new, emerging turning point in our history, in every country. And of course, the narrative, the stances by these parties also are adapted to that. We talk about masks, we talk about vaccines, we talk about the role of medical experts. So there are new issues, new topics, new themes. We can just say, let's suggest a way by which they reshape all the stuff, which just talk about populism plus nationalism plus authoritarianism. But the problem is this just enough talking this way? If you look at more concretely, argument against COVID by mainly, not always, but mainly radical right-wing actors in Europe and US, you look at this. Skepticism about the real danger of the virus, the strong role of immigrants to spread out the virus, against the utility of the mask, against restrictive measures in terms of personal mobility and economic entrepreneurship, against the vaccine as a tool for controlling people by the government, and so on. So all this can find niche of the argument, some classical, some traditional, some nativism, nationalism, authoritarianism. At the same time, you have kind of elements it's a bit strange, freedom of speech. So the radical right-wing populist parties, or a kind of part, ask for, or they claim for more freedom of speech, they claim for economic, free economic entrepreneurship, and more generally, they speak for constitutional rights. So the question is, interesting to see that many of them, in dealing with pro-lockdown, are sometimes pro-lockdown, sometimes they adopt a denialism approach on pandemic, on the virus. But at the same time, they are just also develop a kind of individual freedom claiming, a pro-business policy, and demanding less restriction and defending constitutional rights. So the parties that usually has been presented as illiberal, anti-democratic to some extent, they are defender. They want to be, they present themselves as defender of freedom. That's interesting because it's a kind of difference, because if you compare before, just to say against immigrants, against freedom of immigrants, here they talk about individual freedom. What about that? How we can manage that? How we can connect them each other? When we look at this, we are be aware that there is a kind of mix of traditional and new ideological stuff. New challenges, new critical juncture can put in an agenda, in an ideological stances, new dimensions. And the analysis by scholars should consider carefully these new narrative challenges in relation with their tradition and this part. In this sense, we are in a kind of paradoxical time. On the one side, liberal Democrats defend constitutional rights, and at the same time, because of the pandemic, the opponent seemed to be presented them as a defender of constitutional right. So we are in kind of ambivalent and paradoxical situation. What is clear is that this pandemic opened a new structural opportunity against restrictive measures, especially, leaving open the possibility for this party to present themselves as a defender of people's rights. How is possible? We can say, no, is it just a momentum? Because there are many countries, we stopped for a while some constitutional right, mobility, etc. So we can just to say that's over. The real defender of constitutional rights come back, and these parties are just for a while, for opportunistic reasons, the defenders of that. But I think this answer is not enough. Look at this, for instance, the Islamophobia approach by this party. One of the arguments by which this party instrumentalized the question of Islam in many Western countries is not just based on religion, but also on the defense of woman equality and freedom against West Islam. And what is interesting, they defend values, European Western values and freedom. That's a first complementary alternative response. The other response is to consider that right-wing parties have much more developed much more complex ideological stances in their politics, in their campaign, and we have to go away from usual stereotypes, just anti-democratic, just proto-fascist, fascist, and they are able, in order to win election, to increase their success, to combine different elements. Maybe in an opportunistic way, but they are able to mix different dimensions, modern, anti-modern, communitarian, individualistic, and so on. And in this sense, could be interesting. But the third, it's interesting also, maybe, it's a third answer, is that right-wing ideologies fruitful, articulate, integrate, populism as discourse, frame, and style. This is the question. How you can say that? Because in this way, a definition of populism is not based just on a static definition, but could be real, considered in a very indeterminate way. So look at this definition by a French scholar. Populism is a dimension of political action, susceptible to syncretism, with all form of movement and all type of governments. Whatever dimension of style rather than ideology or form of mobilization, populism is so elastic and indeterminate as to discourage all attempt at a rigorous definition. That's, if you look at this, you can say, okay, stop. We stop our presentation, we talk about other topics. No, it's just because the elastic and indeterminate nature. This could be, on the one side, an opportunity for parties to mix different ideological stances, but also an opportunity for us as a scholar, try to go beyond this indetermination, not just to find a good and universal and one-shot definition, maybe different definition of populism adapted to time and space. So elastic and indeterminate notion can be also an opportunity and not an obstacle. We know populism, if you look at the literature, is a very adaptable in time and space. There are people, many scholars, they say there is left-wing populism, there are right-wing populism. There is also a huge debate about what populism, the relation between populism and democracy and the rule of the law. Is populism against democracy or in favor of democracy? But depends on the definition of democracy, of course, and the definition of populism. There are also questions if you look at the people, the main concept or main core concept of populism, people. What is the people? What really is the people? Is it an homogeneous entity, as Casmude said, or is it a heterogeneous entity, as Laclau, another author, said? What kind is? It's just a mix of multiple dimensions. But usually, scholars say, "Oh, this is a really problem. We have to fix that. We have finally to share one consensual definition." No, that could be an opportunity to open our mind and try to combine in a different way and take this as an opportunity. Populism and conspiracy. Look at this, the idea spread out during the narrative, spread out during the pandemic. For instance, about there are some people working behind in a hidden way, using the virus to control us. This is one of what the scholar called a theory, a conspiracy theory. So populism and conspiracy can be connected using and considering some argument, some discourse erased during the pandemic time. If you look at the definition by Margaret Canavan, one scholar using the classic definition of populism, which include a primacy of a people whose sovereignty is under threat, an opposition between the people and the elite, present as a trait of the elites of the people, and the claim for a coming back of the people's sovereignty. Look at this definition, one of the multiple definitions, of course. Not the unique definition, but one of them. And if you look at this definition, it's interesting to see the convergence between populism and some theory, some definition of conspiracy theories that can be defined as explanation for important events that involve secret plots by powerful, malevolent groups. So the elite working against people. Conspiracy theories view as history as controlled by massive demonic forces outside the true communities, the people on the one side and the conspirators outside. So there are two opponents and two real opposed entities. There are authors, they talk now, Berman, as the case of Berman, it was published a book on conspiracy and populism. And he mentioned the possibility to use conspirational populism, the term and the definition of conspirational populism, not populist in a general way, but conspirational populism, a specific definition of populism. Not all populism are conspirational theories, and not all conspiracy theories integrate the populist claim. However, there is also convergence between populism and conspiracy theories. Some conspiracy theories work as a form of populist discourse. That's just an example. If we look at the pandemic time, we want to use, to some extent, this concept of populism. Why use it in a single, isolated way? We can combine with conspiracy theory approach, trying to develop an integrated concept more specific in order to grasp, to understand some elements, some dimension, some argument of, for instance, right-wing populist parties in pandemic time, but also before and afterwards. Conspirational populism can be defined as a kind of discourse, assuming elites as a malevolent entity toward people whose sovereignty and right are undetermined and undermined. The denunciation of conspiracy aims recovering people's rights. So the idea that we need to recover rights of the people. And this, of course, what about these rights? The rights is sovereignty, the power of their own destination, or the destiny, sorry, and is, of course, a crucial argument in pandemic time when many movements and this kind of parties or leaders attack and claim against government, medical power, and so on. But exactly for this reason, we have to also go beyond the idea that it's just a popular sovereignism as such. Popular sovereignism is one of the clear notions with people included in almost every definition of populism. So the idea of popular sovereignty, what is this reality popular sovereignty? Is real just voting rights? Is real, what is exactly? The point is we should be unsatisfied with a generic definition of sovereignty. There are many kinds of sovereignty. And also, we can also develop this concept of sovereignism, which is not the same as sovereignty, because sovereignty is also an institutional dimension. It's just a claim for restoring popular national sovereignty. So the claim in a populist discourse to restore the undermined and fragile sovereignty of the people. But again, which kind of sovereignty is? Is real only popular and national, for instance? or there is some other dimension. And if you look exactly on this critical juncture, the pandemic time, the criticism against lockdowns, against masks, etc. There is a kind of ask for more freedom for the people in terms of mobility, in terms of economic entrepreneurship, etc. And this idea that the people should be free to decide about their own health, about their own body. They have not to be constrained by the state. And this is one of the main arguments also in this right-wing populist response during pandemic time. So how we can deal with that? Is real sovereignism something just popular, just national, or maybe we can add this concept of individual sovereignty? So I have no time here to develop a lot, because there is a tradition in history of thought, especially in libertarian anarchist tradition, about the concept of individual sovereignty. It's not just my invention or invention, but there is a legacy of thinking about what is individual sovereignty and sovereignty. But look at this, the concept of people. People used by populist scholars. They say people, just we know what this people is. But look at just the difference between the cultural, linguistic difference between French, Italian, and German. We talk about folk, popul. Is this idea is a clear collective body. It's the idea that it's a community. But of course, as you know, in English, this people encompasses, it's just an idea of group of individuals and an idea of individual human beings, not just a group of people as a community, as a community. There is a kind of ambiguity inside a language, inside a cultural legacy, and between languages, and between cultural tradition. Just to say that also inside the concept of people, you can find some openness for parties, for leaders to use differently and to frame differently what people's right is. Is real working rights? Is we defend people as a community, as a nation, or we defend individual freedom? That's interesting, because following this path, we can integrate the definition of people and the defense of individual sovereignty as the idea, not just an individual freedom from generic stuff, not just the idea that the power of individuals about their own body, their own individual itself, the idea the individual are ultimate foundation of power in society. And of course, we have this kind of mix of individual and the communitarian. When we look at this big mobilization in the street everywhere in the world, we look people inside the street. At the same time, they defend individuals. My body, my choice. There is no contradiction, apparently, in society, in the social mobilization. The opposition between individual and collective is just, for me and for them, apparently, a question, not a tricky question, but also an abstract question. So we can imagine, of course, that this party can be both defender of popular, national, individual rights. And the same for the social movement. They can be, they defend individual body, individual freedom, and at the same time being together. So if you look at this, the literature on coming from pandemic time, try to understand what in pandemic time pandemic time expressed in terms of contention, opposition, populism, grievances. We have just two examples. We talk about types of populism. Authors talking about fundamentalist populism, combining distrust toward institution, ideological rigidity, and vindication of individualism and personal freedom. Just an example of this first author, which is with an anthropologist working on Tea Party and Donald Trump supporter. This is just an example. And a second example is the concept of medical populism. It's about medical populism. If you look at this, the actors simplify, dramatize pandemic, targeting medical power as conspirators, as a threat for health people. That's a concept able to frame, to understand this specific aspect of populist grievances, populist opposition, combining both the fact that elites are not just generic elites, not just political elites, but could be also medical elites. In this sense, combining this aspect with the idea of conspiration and the idea that this power is conspiring against people, because the idea that the people, we defend the health of the people, in defending the health of the people, we are against this kind of malevolent elites. We know exactly what is better for us, and we don't need medical elites. That's one of the arguments that we know during the pandemic time. And of course, what did I say about types of populism in the literature is often considered as a taken for granted solution when you talk about national populism. So many scholars, there is a growing debate about the connection between nationalism and populism. And also economic populism nowadays. Of course, economists more than other scholars, but there is an increasing attempt to combine with other tradition. There is medical populism, conspirational populism, but there is also territorial populism, judicial populism. What about judicial populism? But yes, when judges decided against the people feeling, the common people feeling, they are so bad elites. They decided against the people rights. So this, but of course, it means that you work on the role of the judges and the perception and how, for instance, populist parties frame judicial power and they try to attack, justify their attack against judicial power. Of course, judicial power is instrumentalized by competitor in political sphere. Often this argument is raised, but also in Europe, the question is how the judges adopt European-oriented policy and laws in order to justify their role in face immigrant rights, for instance. And there is a huge debate on this, and of course we can talk about judicial populism because this party tried to challenge the division of power between politics, political sphere, and of course judicial sphere. And to conclude, I have my proposal is just very simple. We need, in my opinion, going from generic, universal, or illusionary vision of populism to a much more modest and contextual or specified vision of this concept, if we want to be much more interesting and heuristically interesting also for other scholars, taking account that populists cannot frame everything. We need, of course, a complexity-oriented approach. We need also to be open to a combination of definition. If you have to some extent, when you talk about, for instance, communication of leaders in some specific cases, we can talk about content of this communication, and we can look in this sense on ideology, but you can also look at the style, how these leaders are able to connect with followers, and not just look at the content of the ideology. We can also look at this, the idea of types of populism, connected with time and space, considering the elasticity of the concept as an advantage in order to adapt it to a new critical juncture, of course, on new grievances, new historical experience. In this case, I gave you an example, just modest example about pandemic mobilization in connection with conspirational theories, and the idea of individual, so the definition of the people, of sovereignism, which is not just the defense of popular and national rights, but also individual, just a way to specify populism. This is just the result of my reflection nowadays, and I will continue, and I hope that you are here also for discuss on that, and really hope that you can give me some advices, some insight. And it's the reason because I'm very open, and I'm really glad to be here. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that very stimulating talk. I think what we can do is take questions both from the audience and then if we have any from the webinar, but I think you should stay there because you will be taking the questions, and I will sit here and I can sort of field them because we'll look at if we get any coming in over the Zoom. So let me start here in this room. Anyone want to open the questioning up? This is a very stimulating talk with a lot of different facets to it. And I'm sure there'll be commentary from within the room, but at any rate, who would like to begin? Anyone? It's always hard to get the first person, although not a shy group. Ken, you're smiling. All right, it's you.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Oscar. You've given us a lot to think about, and I like what you're doing and trying to identify, basically what you might think of as different subtypes of populism. So when you talk about this complexity, but when I look at what you do, if you I think you're second from the last slide where you list all these different subtypes of populism, medical, territorial, judicial, national, etc. I mean, essentially what you're doing is, you're adding a descriptive adjective, attaching it to populism as a way of adding additional information, so that, you're telling it what is distinctive about this particular type of populism, generally having to do with either something about the way in which they construct the people or how they construct the elite, if you start with that basic binary divide. But I guess my question is to do that, doesn't that mean that you are starting with a universal core understanding of what populism is, and then you're attaching the descriptive label to tell you a little bit more about it, which is to add additional information? And so I can't help but go back. That was basically an exercise in Giovanni Sartori's ladder of abstraction, if you go back to his classic article in APSR. And so you start with a minimal core conceptualization, and there's another approach, which is where you're adding descriptive adjectives as a way of basically what would be diminished sometimes. Like, I think you can talk, sometimes people do this with democracy. You add an adjective as a way of diminishing to identify the ways in which it falls short of being fully democratic. But what you're doing here is adding descriptive adjectives, starting with that core, saying they all share that common core, but then you add the descriptive adjective to tell us more a little bit about it. So I guess the question is that what you're doing? And if so, what is that universal core for you? I would see it in Canavan and Laclau. I think it's really the same thing. It's a binary divide between the people. It's a way of, for Laclau, populism is you divide the political field between the sovereign people and some sort of conspiratorial elite. And isn't that ultimately what you're doing? You start with that minimum core conceptually, but then you add these labels as a way to specify what subtype it is.
Can I answer?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Unless there's somebody with a follow-up to
yes,
that, but otherwise I think you can take one by one.
Maybe I was not able to explain in a very transparent way what I try to do, but I think the first misunderstanding is the search of a universal core. I think you don't need a common or consensual universal core. Because if you look at the style, if you look at the discourse, if you look at the movement, if you look at the organizational dimension, that's just, you cannot find universal core. Of course, you have something to connect, of course, with the opposition between people and elites. But is this a concept? No, I think it's just a kind of common feeling. But when we talk about populism, we talk about, of course, opposition between people and elites. But this is not, for me, a concept. It's just a common feeling between this family of definitions. So I consider that we have not to find what is the core element, because that, for me, heuristically not useful. For me, the other way is much more important. Is if you want to find analytical concept, you have to be in the middle. So we have to include, to take one of these definitions or a combination of these definitions, style, discourse, ideology, whatever, to connect and going inside this definition and try to specify what this dimension of, because you have people, what's the people is? What's the, if you look at this kind of a definition, but you can also go into other definitions, but if you look at this example kind of, you look, what is the sovereignty? What's the people? Who is the elite? Who is the, what exactly is when you go and you talk about sovereignism or sovereignty? And in this way, you specify. And it's not just a description, it's an analytical framework. Because if you want to look at the, from an analytical point of view, what happens during the COVID pandemic, and you want to look at the argument, of course, definition of populism as discourse. And you look at the argument by many leaders, this concept of conspirational populism allow you to look at the elite in a specific way. Malevolent, hidden, secret work of the elite. Not just the elite as MPs, they work openly against the people. And so you reframe your definition of populism, not just to add from external. This, I don't know if I was enough clear, but it's not the idea of a kind of external theory that you put in populism, but you integrate it. It's embedded. So conspirational populism is not just populism with conspiracy. It's conspirational populism as such. And that using this, you can, of course, focus on specific aspect, not everything. So the idea that we have to modest, so middle range theory, maybe, or that the idea is if you want to respond to the critics of against populism, saying this is an useful concept, we have to go in this way, in my opinion, not to find a universal definition of globalization, capitalism, so or whatever, but to look at the specific dimension. If you look at capitalism, postmodern or post-industrial capitalism, it's not just capitalism at the same time it's populism. If you look at populism from an analytical point of view, you look at a specific dimension of populism. If not, in my opinion, it's not heuristically useful. And then you do what in my opinion, Casmut did. On the one side, I'll give you another example. He said there are populists and not populists in a very clear way. But then when you try to work with this frame, finally, you need a gradation definition of populism. So how you can manage from a theoretical point of view, in a consistent way, this kind of tension. There is a kind of gap between the definition, the core definition, and the analytical use of this definition. There is a gap. So why is this a gap? Because, in my opinion, there is this attempt to put together universal and empirical-oriented approach of this.
Do we have a? If not, I'm going to say something. About 15 years ago, this is maybe think about this. One of the books that people were citing all the time was a book by Peter Hall and David, I may not pronouncing his name right, Soskis. And it was called Varieties of Capitalism. And what their argument basically was that, you know, capitalism isn't one thing. And you could find varieties of it, and you have to look, and then you could begin to talk about it. More or less approximates it when you say it. So I was thinking as you were speaking, you know, to what extent is this something one could sort of transverse over to the concept of populism? And I think there might be a difference between capitalism and populism in the sense that even though there are varieties of it, and it takes place in different cultures and different historical locations, there is some certain core things that everybody would more or less agree were capitalistic. Most likely the sort of, you know, the need to produce surplus value. I'm thinking of Marx because I was teaching him this morning, but at any rate, so my thought is if one were to sort of take that analysis and then try to think about populism in those terms, is there a there? And I mean, I'm on record, I've said this and written this in many places, that I think it's a much more fungible and plastic analytic category. So I'm not for a single definition by any means, but it does sort of beg the question, maybe we can think about that there is, you know, to engage your argument where it stands, then where can we find some core, you know? And as I listened to you, and one of the reasons I thought of the varieties of capitalism argument is what I was hearing is that you're sort of calling in a way for a historical analysis. It's the different iterations of populism take place in different times and spaces, although most of them are what we're looking at right now. And I'm not sure what analytic purchase then you get, or if there's not another way into what you're trying to do than to use this term. In other words, I want to save the term because I want to enter your analysis, but I'm also raising a question. The questions sort of come from the way you structured your talk here today. So I don't know if that sheds any light or can help you move forward with an answer or discussion, but I think it's worth thinking about.
I give you, maybe I try to respond, maybe not directly to your concept, but I try to give you an example. My empirical research, I try to develop empirical research, but also theoretical oriented, a concept of economic sovereignism.
Okay.
Economic sovereignism is a specific way to grasp sovereignism. So the idea to the claim for coming back, for a coming back of sovereignty. That means both leaders, but also citizens and voters can be aware, or they ask of their grievances, because we need finally to recover our sovereignty, national sovereignty, popular sovereignty against Europe, etc., etc. But in this way, if you look at this populist grievance in general, I think it's not enough. If you look at the specific dimension, so the people, they don't necessarily ask for sovereignty in terms of cultural, identitarian, but also in terms of economic prosperity. And how you can understand that from a theoretical point of view and empirical point of view, you have to look precisely on this dimension of economic and material prosperity, but connected with the feeling and the grievance of the people. So the point is how you can focus exactly on this if you have a concept, you avoid a concept of economic sovereignty, which is included in populism, because it's one of when the populists ask in the kind of a definition, ask for a strong change, a big change, in order to recover to a coming back of sovereignty. So we focus exactly on this. We develop a survey analysis, a comparative analysis, in different countries, in Europe and US. So we try to focus precisely on this specific element, to what extent the demand for economic prosperity in connection with sovereignty and national sovereignty is, or to what extent is, one of the explanatory factors, this is quantitative analysis, of the support toward Trump, toward some other leaders. So if you have a generic definition of populism, if you note this middle level definition of economic sovereignty included in definition, more general definition of economic populism, because of course the elite is betraying people, not just because they are against the rights, because they are against the prosperity of the people. They do everything against the prosperity of the people. They're increasing taxes, or they support immigrants, and so on and so on. But from an economic point of view, if you want to focus precisely on this, you need a specific concept and specific question on this. And you cannot just say, okay, rights in a generic way. You cannot just sovereignty in a generic way, because it's a mixed of cultural, identitarian, political, economic, plenty of dimension. So just an example to see how we can do concretely that. Now, of course, my insatisfaction is theoretical, but also connected with my research. And of course, we need to connect strictly a new frame, new analytical frame, new concept with empirical. Of course, can do interviews, ethnographic research in connection with this concept, because you are interested in a specific aspect. Of course, you can do everything, but the mix of dimension, the complexity of dimension, including this generic universal definition of populism, for me, in my opinion, is not enough to understand the complexity of the argument, the complexity of the discourse, the capacity of these parties, of the leader to be successful in our society. So we have also to focus more concretely. That's my, I don't know if an answer, but that's my feeling about that.
Yeah, other questions, follow-ups? Yes, I see Enzo, and then I don't know your name, but
thank you for the very rich talk. Maybe I might be not understanding things correctly, but I kept thinking this feeling of how I actually face the term populism in journalism, newspapers, and I often recognize it as a word that is being weaponized against certain groups and used as an analytical tool to really look into things. So in case of the uses of word, it is often working as a weapon instead of a framework to describe or identify the situation better. I wonder if your understanding of the term as the elastic and also sort of, I forgot the other word, ambivalent, intentionally ambivalent term to analyze the situation is, I don't know, in a way working. And another question I have is whether, how, I mean, it may be a blunt question, but like, why do you bring this word to the Western sphere instead of the global thing? Because I also see a lot of populist phenomena that are happening on the other side of the globe.
So I started from the second question. I think we need to be, in this kind of approach, we need to be very contextual oriented. So we cannot just talk about everything everywhere. My modest knowledge is on Western countries, or to some extent Western countries, maybe more European, and I have no knowledge enough to speak about other contexts. That's just the first answer. There's just not a. I think you are right. Maybe we have to develop more, but we have also to consider that there are different legacies, institutional, political, cultural legacies, and we have to be careful about in this idea of populist definition or definition of populism. Look at this, Latin America. I'll give you an example of in this term. When you talk about Peronist populism, probably Peronist populism is another way to define it in a specific, not that, in my opinion, it's not just descriptive, because there is a legacy and you can define much more, at least theoretical, today, theoretically, what Peronist is to some extent with some characteristics. Not that populism in general, but maybe, on the East, I'm not Middle East, etc. I'm not specialist, and also I'm not specialist in Latin America, but just to give you an example. The first question is another level of discourse, because should be another talk about populism as a political movement. Because populism is a polemic term in political field, in political system, in electoral campaigning. And this is a crucial point. I work on this too, but just to put away today. I think it's a very crucial point. We have not just to say, oh, we are scholars, and then you are political field, we are completely separated. So we have to be aware that our analytical use of the term is also connected with populist grievances inside the political sphere, and the use of the term in a polemic, stigmatizing way by political actors. So this creates a supplementary difficulty to use that. It's precisely the reason, because we need definition. Because not just to say populism as such, we need definition, because also we have to distinguish ourselves from the polemic use, because it's, of course, populism as demagoguery, populism as just manipulation. Populism is a common definition in political field, and we have to be careful about that. Of course, there are many, but when you talk about nationalists or nationalism, could be similar. In many contexts is a polemic, stigmatizing word. In other contexts should be also kind of positive. Populism the same. Going, for instance, in Quebec, in Canada, Quebec, and you say nationalism could be also positive, in a positive way. It's telling the police in a positive way in political battles, in campaigning, etc. But of course, many other countries is a negative. But that's the reason, because we need definition, but not one, plural.
We have two more people at least lined up here, Enzo Traverso and then Sid Tara. So, Enzo.
Yeah. So I agree with you on. I'm quite convinced about your argument that populism is a very ambiguous, contradictory, elastic plural concept, but that we can nonetheless make a useful, have a useful approach, a fruitful use of this concept. If we use this concept properly, related to specific case. It seems to me that populism could be considered as a strong concept, as an ideology, when considered in historical terms. So in the 19th century, in the United States, in Russia, there was a populism that was conceptualized as an ideology, as a political project, as a political strategy. And I would say the same for Peronism, at least for classical Peronism, for years. Today, the concept of populism is much more elastic, ambiguous, and so difficult to grasp and to manage. But so, if we define populism as a rhetoric or as a political style consisting in the opposition between supposed virtuous people against the corrupted elite. So this kind of rhetoric of discourse exists everywhere. And this kind of discourse could allow us to establish analogies between left-wing political discourse and right-wing political. So we can find this rhetoric in Hugo Chavez and, I don't know, Marine Le Pen. But so this is a similar rhetoric related to antipodal projects, ideologies, and discourse. So this is the big problem of concept of populism. But what about anti-populism? Because it seems to me that today there is a major threat to democracy, which comes not only from this constellation of multiple populisms, but there is also a threat to democracy coming from what is usually called anti-populism. So in Western Europe, for instance, in Western Europe, anti-populism posits a kind of political paradigm, which is neoliberalism plus liberal democracy, market society plus liberal democracy. Any kind of opposition against to neoliberalism is immediately stigmatized as populism. Any kind of criticism to the way in which liberal democracy is structured or functions today is stigmatized as populism. So it seems to me that anti-populism is a similarly widespread rhetoric, and anti-populism is one of the main sources of populism itself. This kind of demagogic anti-populism has become a kind of motor or source for implementing what is usually called populism. So what do you think about that?
Yes, I think I think your argument is absolutely. I completely agree with this argument. Is this exactly for this reason that we need to be aware that as a scholar, we are part of the game. So we, to some extent, when we talk about populism in an academic or public sphere, we contribute to some extent to define some parties, some actors are populist and easily instrumentalized by actors and by journalists. They say, academic scholars say this is a populist party. So, and of course, they forgot the definition by scholars. And they say, this party is a populist. So we contribute, and populist is a bad party. So we could also contribute, and we have to be aware that we contribute also to this definition of the opposition between anti and populist. Because as a scholar, often we are allies, we are part of the game in constructing populist targeting, populist stigmatization. Also, we have, this I think we are our responsibility. Because I agree with you, because to some extent we are, if you look at this in reality, what scholars do in newspapers, interviews, there is a big project in Europe with Guardian that they finally, scholars are also part of the game. They contribute to give a scientific justification to this opposition between anti-populism and populism. Because there are, of course, the defender of liberal democracy on the one side, and the others are more or less considered as a challenger to democracy, because democracy is ipso facto liberal democracy and market. And this is, of course, I think it's one of the big issue of scholars working on populism, because often they are not aware, in the literature also not aware of this issue, because they think we are just outside of this public and political battle, and we are just observer, external observer. But this positivist approach is not realistic at all. And I agree with you. The point is, nowadays, when we talk about the public sphere, about populist parties, populist leaders, we participate to this kind of definition of the public frame, who said, on the one, we are just two camps. One is the camps of populists, right wing, left wing, and the other are the good politicians or the good institutional politicians. That's for me one of the big issues and the big challenge that we have to consider and to be much more aware. And finally, only a few literature on these issues exist. So political scientists are not really concerned by that.
We have one more question. I don't want to cut the discussion because it's a really important discussion, but I want to get Sid Taro's question in here, and I'm going to read it, and it is related, I think, in different ways to the discussion here. And he says, I'm going to read it directly. In your final remarks, you mentioned the relations between leaders and followers. My question, is there a populist form of leader-follower relations, or does this too vary for different forms of populism? If the former, what is it? If the latter, how can we distinguish populism from other forms of politics? So I think that does in a way articulate, because we don't really have the left here. We only have the globalists and the technocrats and the bad guys.
So it's of course a tricky question. The point is exactly this: the fact that the public use or political use of populism, and in analogy of the political use of history. So we have just that the political use of populism also try to occupy everything and say every resistance, every opposition, every social contention today is more considered populist. That's the problem that we have, because we are also influenced by this public use of populism, and exactly what you said before. And I think that's the problem of scholarship too, because scholarship, in the scholarship, we have in the last 20 years, we have a growing industrial production in populist literature, and finally everything is nowadays framed as populist. In the left wing, left wing, right wing, in many countries. And look at for instance, Occupy Street movement. Is this populist or not? Let's give you just an example, or we need other tools or a framework in order to frame this mobilization. Look at the yellow vest in France, 2019 or 2018. Also considered as populist. So everything is populist. That's for me a big issue, a problem, because of course often we have a just generic definition of populist. Every movement is against the elite is populist. That's the reason, because we need much more concrete, specific definition of populism, and not just embracing or generic definition, because if not, every social mobilization, every anti-establishment mobilization in democracy nowadays, it just put a defined label as populism. And then it's very easy, on the one side, to delegitimize other theoretical approach, for instance, social movement approach, and at the same time, delegitimize this movement because the establishment, media, etc., use the term of populism, saying just you are stigmatized. So we contribute to the stigmatization of this contestation, of this resistance, or this opposition. So I think there are two aspects. One is a theoretical and conceptual aspect, and one is the social responsibility of the scholar.
Okay, well, on that note, we are at 5:46, and I think it's time to sort of call an end to this because we've sort of given us much to think about. I want to thank you for this wonderful and very stimulating talk, and I want everybody to know that Oscar is going to be here till the end of the month. And you can all meet with him and have private discussions. He's here to work and to meet with us. So I think the conversation can continue, definitely. So thank you again.
Thank you very much.
A pleasure to listen to you.